Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next session of the Healthcare Summit. This is with Pena Posey. And the title of this presentation is It's Grief, How Existential Pain Can Be a Portal to More Passionate Purpose. Pena Posey is a modern day medicine woman who guides visionary women, entrepreneurs, and helping professionals out of boredom, burnout, and boxed in experiences into soul fulfilling passion and purpose from the inside out. She is traditionally trained as an integrative nurse practitioner and psychotherapist, and consciously deconstructed guide and catalyst for soul initiation and vital creative living. Thank you so much for joining us today, Amber. It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Valerie. I love their summit that you guys are doing. And yeah, this is fun. We're going to talk about a little bit of heavier topics than that, like the catalyst. But of course, that heaviness is, and the metabolism that we need to feel of our big feelings that are kind of lean on that quote negative spectrum are really what allow us to access and expand into our bigger visionary collective changes that are essential for us. So yes, I'm excited to talk about this. And I know that there were some experientials, and I usually like to start with an experiential, but what I decided to do for this conversation was to read a poem to kind of set the stage for everybody. And what you can do when you listen to the poem, though, is close your eyes and, feel into your heart. What I always say about creativity and the arts, how they help us. They let us connect to our heart space. And I often talk about when you're doing inner work that you're in this cavernous space, right? It can be its own galaxy. And so close your eyes. You're listening with your heart, not necessarily with like your analytical mind. And that might set the stage for what we're about to talk about. So the poem is called Disrobing in Time. It's by Mark Nepo. And I'll read it slowly. Nothing is easy but to tell the truth of what I see and feel. This somehow cleanses my eye and it becomes clear what to do. In my pain, I forget to admit what is true and things get worse. Because I don't want to be sad, I don't admit that I already am. Then I feel like I'm drowning. Because I don't want things to change, I don't admit that they already have. Then I feel like the wheel of life is tearing me apart. The greatest power we have when feeling powerless is to admit what is already true. Then the stepping stones of eternity rise out of the mud, showing us where to go. So hopefully you guys can feel that. And I think that's what we're all up against, right? As we work in healthcare and we work to change from the inside out and not judging ourselves or even others and or the system. I know I went through my own period of kind of like raging against the machine, but really being like, oh, it's grief, right? And I think the beauty of saying burnout is it feels palatable in ways that are effective. We need to have that. But if we also look at the larger landscape, the way I was trained as a psychotherapist was all psychotherapy is grief work. So that takes away the pathology of doing inner work. It takes away of like I have a problem, I have to go solve it, which is a fine way to start. But it actually lets more people be interested in, oh, grief work. And our culture does not support grief as a healthy part of life. We want things to be tied up in a nice bow so we can move on and function. And again, there's a time and a place. However, that's not life, that's not reality. And when we take away the human experience, we actually are going to take away the potential to expand into our higher selves. And so grief is a maturation process. That is actually what establishes elders in the world versus all of us acting as children in grown-up bodies and grown-up clothes, right? So grief actually does have a cleansing process to support us to really be the vessels that we are. And so I talk about being a healer as, you're containing, you're a vessel, you're not just a doer. Doesn't mean you don't have the doing, obviously, but you are a being and you're helping people in the most formative times of their lives often, be it, preventative health care where you can really help make change to acute crisis. So human suffering, as well as the transitions and thresholds of, say, the adolescent stages or the toddler stages when you're helping parents learn how to be, healthy parents. So if we look at this if we look at the SOAP model, subjective is going to be everyone's own experience, and that's something that it's why it's so important to tell your story to at least one safe other. The objective, I think we're all pretty clear in that, like burnout, if we're talking about burnout as part of this catalyst that's happening, as part of the struggle that's going on, because that is why we're seeing people pulling out of the workforce, people saying they've had enough, right? There's a cynicism that occurs, exhaustion. And then if we think about the plan for burnout, there's system change we have to do, and also individual. However, it can be tough because people don't want to take on responsibilities, as they shouldn't, for a whole entire system. Yet there is a need for individual and system change, right? So if we kind of pull back and just say, like, well, what if it's grief as well as a larger umbrella? That can kind of help us a little bit with a sense of none of us are exempt from grief in our lives. Whereas when you're thinking about burnout, especially if you're working with high achievers and people who love the accomplishment, most people who are in healthcare are actually really resilient. We know how to handle stress. We stay in healthcare. We help work through that. It can make you feel shame sometimes because you're feeling like, I'm not able to get through this transition, this burnout stage. Because again, it's about the work desire can be really a struggle. Especially if your purpose is very tied to your work, which again, most healthcare providers, that it is. So if we think about it in that larger umbrella of grief, that can help you with an assessment model for yourself. Again, if we're doing the SOAP, and looking at what is actually happening, it's a non-pathological model. But again, having an assessment of it so that you don't get stuck in these nice tied boxes that have to be this way. Grief can be complicated. There's a diagnosis about complicated grief, but it actually is complicated for everybody. It's not pathological. It's complex, it's complicated. And so some of the struggle can be if our culture of healthcare likes things in, if you think about it, algorithms that help us make solutions. If you think about like the blood pressure diagnostic model, you can like see the standards, you can look at the things, you can say like, okay, if this, then that. And that's great. We need that kind of healthcare for sure. It's very important. But let me take away the word mental, emotional well-being, spiritual struggles. Spirit to me, what I like to remind people about is like your sense of life force, your vitality. So if spirituality kind of can be a turnoff because of, say, religious traumas or any kind of issues, if you can think about it that way, like what's keeping me from my sense of life force? What's keeping me from my vitality? Then that can help you, again, take a look at this larger picture of like, I want that back. And if you're really feeling like you can't get that, there's a lot of grief, especially if you've been using it through work. And so those kind of issues are not going to be algorithmic. They're not going to be standard. They have to be, and most things are not going to be standard, but because we all customize even, say, blood pressure. But they're really going to need to have a customized touch. And that can be hard when we're looking at people pulling out of the workforce, when we're looking at a health crisis, like, okay, but we also have to have, concrete things. So it's a both and. It's not an either or, but it is, how are you as the person, yourself, the healthcare provider, allowing for the fact that you may be experiencing your own grief, you may be experiencing the collective grief, an existential grief, and then there's also something called disenfranchised grief. I'm going to make sure that that's linked. I don't think I had it ready in time, but there's a great article from 2017. I'll read the definition of that. It's about physicians and disenfranchised grief, but it's really applicable to everybody. So DOCA defines disenfranchised grief as grief that persons experience when they incur a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged publicly mourned, or socially supported. And so for a lot of us in healthcare, burnout is definitely like the trending word. And it's definitely the word I've used for a really long time too. But it's almost like that's the safe word. And the reason why I read that poem was like when we don't really name what's going on, we're continuing to feel more pain. And so if we think about that, a lot of us in healthcare who had a sense of purpose and passion tied to our work and feel grief don't know how to kind of get through it. And sometimes burnout's the right word and sometimes it's not. And they're mirroring each other. There's usually both. So I just want to kind of set that stage. So the assessment then is, again, we can have differential diagnosis models where is it this, is it that, and keeping a rule out model available, because the other thing is thinking of the personality types of healthcare providers. We don't like to feel helpless, right? It's a normal thing to not want to feel helpless, and we're the helpers. So like the shadow of the wounded healer is I am here for everybody, but I can't fully be helpless because what will I do? Who will help me? And that fear of like, can we be safe to share that with each other without people saying like, okay, we'll do this, because we're also really good at providing solutions. And we're like, oh, it's real simple, do this, right? So grief requires a sense of space, a sense of time, and that can feel hard when you put it up against the pressure of we have to fix the system. So again, the complexity starts entering into the space. So I think I talked a little bit. I don't know if you have any questions from there or thoughts. I just wanted to kind of set the stage a little bit.
I think
I wanted to say something.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
Oh, hi.
hello. Um, I mean, it's just now that I'm like learning how to be with someone in their pain. Like
Mm-hmm.
for me, always wanted like to cheer them up, like to
Yeah.
like okay, like oh, but like, look at the price side and like I'll give the advice, but it's like I almost feel like there is like these like I feel uncomfortable with the
Mm-hmm.
pain of someone else. So I think it's also like part of being more aware and maybe working intentionally on it, on like when it's okay just to be in the pain and
Yeah.
not do anything, right?
Yeah. And I have a guide for everybody at the end that's going to be like in the toolbox that everyone's giving. And I say it's the 5 A's. The first one is awareness. And it's kind of again like what the poem talks about, because so many people don't like pain. And if you think that cheering up is the solution, and it's not that cheering up isn't part of it. If you think about if you're at a wake in a funeral, right, there's usually laughter, there's tears, there's all these emotions. But if we're scared of pain, and think about the biological part of us as humans, organisms do not want to be in pain. It's normal to run away. But the reality, the growth of being a human is I can hold it all. Now, in order to hold it all, we need support. No one can hold it all on their own. But part of that grief process, that cleansing that occurs, is when you go through your own grief, individual, collective components that are adding to it. So it may be your own individual, but also say the collective that it does it. You end up retrospectively, you see the resilience that you are a survivor. And generally in psychotherapy, we're taught to hold pain. But again, I'm trained psychotherapist, and the feeling that when I was having my own kind of pain around, I'm feeling burned out, I'm like, what's happening? I've done all this self-care prevention. I was like running from it, and also trained to know that this is grief work, and wanting to be like, give me a solution, right? And luckily, I work with someone who's 75 years old, who's been doing this for 50 years, right? He's not going to just give me a pat solution. He's like, this is the work, right? It's learning to hold. And I believe in the art of medicine, not just the science. So it's a both end. And that is that healer helper, right? It is being the artist of what is needed now with the scientific background that helps us, right? So we get to have the modern components that add to what do we know? We know how the brain works. But that heart to heart, and Claudia, you did a heart experience. That heart to heart is the healing. And so if you can't give that to yourself, it's really hard to do it for others. And so your own work is, if you're going to be holding space for people, is, am I doing it for myself too? Like, if I hold space for others, who holds space for me? And it's that sense of, we need that collective understanding, and to not put inner work, grief work, as a medical model, or as a sense of like, only when I'm ill do I get it. It's okay if that's how we first start, but in the end, it's like lifelong practices. For, in my opinion, most helpers and healers need to always have a safe space of holding what it means to be around existential pain and individual pain when you're working with suffering. Because we are working with suffering. We're not working with only the good parts. And watching someone from suffering into thriving is a beautiful experience. However, it tests the mettle of you, right? It's like a proving ground for you in like heating up, who am I? And if you have a sense of, I have to be this good, it's about being good versus being human, then that can also create issues. So there's like a critical thinking that's necessary to be a helper. And then there's, if I turn critical thinking into self-criticism and self-judgment, then there's no space, right? So that's, again, this idea of like, what if this is grief that we're all working with? And none of us have had, I shouldn't say none of us, because there are definitely people who have had really healthy experiences growing up, but a lot of us haven't. So if we have had people who are fearful of pain, and if we think about kind of collectively, a lot of us are the descendants of people who went through world wars, and they had to get, like, the world fell apart, right? They had to like get the world back in order. And so you have collective traumas. And so again, if healthcare, if you tend to struggle with that word trauma, another thing to think about is like, okay, well, what if it's grief? Because again, trauma is often not processed fully. So this idea of, what if we start using words that aren't so scary, that are human, instead of diagnostically model oriented, that is simple solutions that we're really looking at. And again, no one in this summit is talking about simple solutions, but this idea of like, it's both end. There are going to be some simple things, and there are going to be some complex things. There's going to be a long time frame that we're looking at. There's going to be a short time frame. Learning how to be that kind of vision pull out, and then that kind of microscopic detail that we need.
I think that's really interesting I love how you say it's grief, because I think that, when I think of grief, I think of just when I kind of shifted my perspective from provider to patient, because really very much when I was in the NICU and in that first year, where I felt like I had a grief process that the only thing that helped me in that time was going on walks in nature. And it was a very kind of interesting time of the year. In the Northern Hemisphere, it was early spring, but it was still very cold. And I remember seeing just little bulbs popping up from the snow. And that visual made so much of a difference for me, because it made me think about the seasons, and it made me think about, how we can grow, and how can we provide more sunlight, or how can we provide more nourishment in the soil, whatever that is. But it was a very helpful kind of visual for me during that time.
Yeah.
And I still don't have the answers for how do I do that as a provider standpoint, but I feel like it's that kind of inside out work that you're talking about, kind of acknowledging that grief process, acknowledging where I became hurt, and kind of the distrust in the system and all of that. Working through that a bit more. And then anyway, more just kind of my thoughts as you're talking.
Yeah, well, I love it, because I talk about seasons a lot too, this idea of seasons. So if you're in a season of grief, and again, if you think about particularly the sense of urgency and pressure that is like, I mean, if it's about your career, like for me, I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to be pulling back from my work hours, which means I'll be pulling back on my income. Like, I was willing to take on some things that not maybe everybody does want to do. I'm self-employed, it's a little bit different, but I was like, okay, this season is not going to be about growth. And again, culturally, we are obsessed with growth at all costs, at bigger, better, faster, right? And so there's a sense of you, when you're in grief, you're kind of in a time outside of time as well. So one of the words that is often used subjectively is I'm disoriented, I'm disillusioned, I'm dislocated. And so if you think about all the disses, right? I'm at disease. So when you're disoriented, you're reorienting. You're not going to be in the same kind of timeline. And that's why we have to be aware of like earlier versus like I have to pull out. So paying attention in teams when you're working, particularly in a bigger system, noticing what's going on with your staff because, and your peers and your colleagues, because you have time to be a human where you're like, something's up. Their capacity to hold hope and inspiration and all the things that are really important as helpers is kind of going down. And if we think it's just, again, cynicism from, say, the burnout, and I uniquely talk about this because I was not burned out tied to workload. I was self-employed, and I actually created a self-care model of like, I'm not going to work constantly when I'm holding big experiences for humans. Like it's a very hard skill to do when you're working constantly. So I know it's not necessarily about the workload. There's also your own season of life tied to a lot of this happens in midlife, and midlife is a time to be like, where am I? Am I still on track where I thought I was? So younger people are really learning to kind of build that muscle of working hard, moving up that mountain. But when you're here and you're looking up, like, look at all I've accomplished, and you're feeling empty inside because you've kind of lost a relationship with yourself in order to provide, that is grief. That's not necessarily burnout, right? But again, they have so much similarities, it doesn't matter. It's more of like what's working for you. So I'm a big fan of letting people use the words that work for them. I just want to give us like the umbrella of grief, especially because of that high achiever kind of temperament that occurs, and feeling validated in your work because it's a purposeful job. So the problem with saying like you got to find purpose is most people who've stayed in healthcare have purpose. That's why they stay. People who leave sooner are like, yeah, this maybe isn't the thing. That's not 100% true, but that can be. But I was like 20 years out when this was happening. So 20 years out to me is not because I don't have purpose. I had plenty of purpose. It was more a realigning, reorienting, and that disillusionment of like the true illumination of like, okay, well, what does that really mean then? Like, how am I buying into the cultural conditions versus Amber's values? And so that your own values add to the collective. And again, we're in a this concept is we're in a trauma culture versus an initiation culture. So I use the word threshold or portal in the title. If you think of things as initiations, that's kind of traditional, why I say a medicine woman, right? The traditional model, when you think about that, is preparing people for who they really are meant to be versus the young part of you that's kind of learning how to be part of society. But when you you go in an initiation, there is a pull into who are you really here to be so that you can actually bring back to the collective your unique gifts. That's very different than trauma culture, which is modern day society saying this, and this. You have to have enough money. You have to be, you have to have these titles. And if you don't, you're going to die. You're not going to survive, right? So healthcare providers, we get into the same toxicity or the same contamination as every human. It's like swimming in the water. But our jobs do require us to hold pain, and our jobs do require us to model humanity. It's a very different job kind of description. And so if we can't be human to ourselves and we can't be human to our peers and our colleagues, how can we be to our patients, right? How can we do that? And so it's that inside out work that is required. And so it's not to like say like, it's not to like give initiation this like beautiful sense of like worshiping it, because it is implying there's going to be some kind of need, right? That it's not going to be fully enjoyable. But it is a sense of that is that maturation stage. And I'm seeing people's comments, but I can't I can't necessarily pop so much in with that. But yeah, this is that idea of like, what if I don't run from this process and I don't try to make it faster than it may need to be tied to other people? Like for me, my process felt pretty long, and there was a comparison part of me that was like, how long can this take? And then I also thought like, oh, okay, I thought I could hold pain. But the reality is, I have to expand the vessel to hold more, right? Especially because I believe in helping people to thrive more than I just believe in helping people survive. And in order to get there, all of you has to be allowed. So that sense is that it's really important. I'm going to leave it with a quote that I really love, which is, joy is the matriarch of a family of emotions. She won't come in your house if her children are not welcome. And so if we can't allow for sadness, if we can't allow for grief, if we can't allow for rage, if we can't allow for anger, it doesn't mean it has to be acted out. But if we can't allow for the feelings, you will not actually feel true joy, because the full expanse of emotions are only allowed when you allow them all in. Now, again, you usually need support with that. You usually need someone, and generally it's not to be vulnerable with groups and groups of people until you feel like that's been metabolized where you can talk about it, right? But usually one safe other. And that's why, in my opinion, for the plan, and part of the plan will be in my guide for people, but the plan is your mentors, your guides, your advisors, it can be a therapist for sure, but say it's not, because not everybody thinks that they want to do therapy. It can't be tied to the person that works at your job, right? There's got to be some separateness. It doesn't mean they couldn't be at your job, but if they're in a systems, I really like to talk about this idea of that people need autonomy with who their safe person is, where it's not tied to their work. So if you are going to be somebody who works in the systems, say you're a coach who's like, can do transformational stuff, it's really important that you can share with the organization that may hire you, like, this is privacy that doesn't get tied to career, right? And so almost like how we get CEU credit, this idea of like, where could the credit be where people get to have a mentoring that feels safe for them, that is for the big topics, not just a sense of peer-to-peer mentoring that is tied to the work, right? Because that's its own special need.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, Amber. I think this is such an important perspective that you bring up. And I put into the chat your guide. So check it out. And we'll also make sure when we post replays and when we post everything that we include that guide in there. And I feel like I could talk with you all day, Amber. We have about a minute or so before we switch to Darlene. Does anyone have any questions for Amber before we switch over? Thank you so much.
Sure. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Amber. I really think this is very interesting perspective. And thank you again for your vulnerability and for all the important information you shared today with us.
Yeah, great. And I look forward to watching more of the replays that I haven't seen and being part of it. So thank you guys so much. I'm so excited to be part of these lovely group of leaders.
Me too. Thank you so much, Amber.
Bye.
Bye.